Summer's return to Genoa City didn't come with a warning, a call, or even a hint. It arrived like a storm that had been building quietly off the horizon, only to crash into everyone's lives with undeniable force. She stepped into the familiar streets carrying more than just emotional weight. In her arms was a little girl whose very existence had the power to unravel everything Kyle thought he understood about his past, his choices, and the fragile sense of control he had fought so hard to maintain. The moment Kyle saw them, Summer standing there, visibly changed yet unmistakably herself, and the child clinging to her, time seemed to fracture. His breath caught, his mind scrambling to reconcile the reality before him with the life he had been living. There was confusion first, then disbelief, and finally a deep, aching realization that settled into his chest like a stone. This child, this little girl with curious eyes and an innocence untouched by the chaos surrounding her, was his daughter. The revelation didn't come with dramatic declarations or elaborate explanations at first. Instead, it unfolded in the silence between them, in the way Summer looked at Kyle, not with anger, not even with accusation, but with a quiet resolve that spoke volumes. She had carried this truth alone for so long, shielding it, protecting it, perhaps even fearing it. And now, standing there in Genoa City once more, she had made the decision to bring it into the light. Consequences be damned. Kyle's reaction was raw and immediate. The tears came before he could stop them, before he could even fully process why he was crying. It wasn't just the shock or the overwhelming surge of emotion, it was the crushing weight of lost time, of moments he had never known existed. First steps, first words, sleepless nights, laughter, memories that should have been his were now nothing more than stories he would have to hear secondhand. As word of Summer's return spread, Genoa City buzzed with speculation, concern, and curiosity. People who thought they understood the dynamics between Summer and Kyle quickly realized that there was far more beneath the surface than anyone had imagined. Old wounds, long buried, began to resurface, and relationships that had seemed stable suddenly felt precarious. For some, the news was a shock. For others, it was a puzzle piece that finally made sense of past tensions and unspoken conflicts. But for Kyle, none of that mattered as much as the small, fragile bond forming between him and the daughter he had never known. Their first real interaction was tentative, almost fragile in its simplicity. He knelt down, trying to make himself less intimidating, his voice soft and uncertain as he spoke to her. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation, glancing back at Summer for reassurance. It was in that moment that the reality of the situation truly hit him. He wasn't just confronting a secret or dealing with the fallout of a complicated past. He was stepping into the role of a father. And fatherhood wasn't something you could ease into when you had already missed so much. It demanded presence, patience, and an emotional openness that Kyle wasn't sure he was ready for, yet knew he couldn't avoid. Summer, meanwhile, remained composed on the surface, but beneath that calm exterior was a whirlwind of emotion. Bringing her daughter to Genoa City had not been an easy decision. She had weighed every possible outcome, every risk, every potential consequence. She knew the impact it would have on Kyle, on their families, and on the life she had built away from all of this. But she also knew that the truth had a way of surfacing eventually, and when it did, it was often far more destructive if it had been hidden for too long. By coming back now on her own terms, she was taking control of the narrative, even if it meant facing judgment, anger, or heartbreak. The hidden truth didn't just affect Kyle and Summer, it sent ripples through everyone connected to them. Friends and family were forced to confront their own assumptions and biases. Some questioned Summer's decision to keep the child a secret, wondering whether Kyle had been unfairly denied the chance to be part of his daughter's life. Others sympathized with her, recognizing the complexity of the situation and the possible reasons she might have had for staying silent. There were no easy answers, no clear right or wrong, only layers of emotion and perspective that made the situation all the more difficult to navigate. Kyle's journey from shock to acceptance was anything but smooth. There were moments of anger, flashes of resentment that he struggled to suppress. He wanted to understand why Summer had kept this from him, why she had made the choice to carry such a significant truth on her own. Yet every time he looked at his daughter, those feelings seemed to dissolve, replaced by a fierce determination to be present in her life moving forward. He couldn't change the past, no matter how much it hurt, but he could shape the future. And that realization became the anchor that kept him grounded as everything else seemed to shift around him. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock began to settle, giving way to a more nuanced reality. Kyle started to find his footing as a father, learning the small details that made his daughter who she was, her favorite stories, the way she laughed at simple things, the subtle expressions that hinted at her thoughts and feelings. Each discovery was both a joy and a reminder of what he had missed, but instead of letting that regret consume him, he chose to focus on building something new. Slowly, cautiously, a bond began to form, one that was rooted not in the past, but in the present and the possibilities it held. Summer watched this transformation with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had hoped for this outcome, had believed that Kyle would step up once he knew the truth, but hope and reality were not always aligned. Seeing him embrace his role, despite the circumstances, reassured her that she had made the right decision in coming back. Yet there was still an undercurrent of uncertainty, questions about what this meant for their relationship, about how they would navigate co-parenting in a world that was anything but simple. Genoa City, as always, became a backdrop for this unfolding drama, its familiar settings now charged with new meaning. Conversations that once revolved around routine matters now carried an edge of intrigue, as people speculated about what would happen next. Would Kyle and Summer find their way back to each other, united by the child they shared? Or would the weight of the past prove too heavy, pushing them in different directions despite their connection? The answers were not immediately clear, and perhaps that was what made the situation so compelling. What remained undeniable, however, was the impact of Summer's return. It had shattered illusions, revealed hidden truths, and forced everyone involved to confront realities they might have preferred to ignore. It was a turning point, not just for Kyle and Summer, but for the entire community that had become intertwined with their lives. And at the center of it all was a little girl, unaware of the storm she had brought with her, yet quietly shaping the course of everyone's future simply by being there. In the end, the story wasn't just about shock or betrayal or even redemption. It was about the unexpected ways life can change in an instant, about the resilience required to face those changes, and about the possibility of finding something meaningful even in the midst of upheaval. Summer's return to Genoa City had done more than reveal a secret. It had opened the door to a new chapter, one filled with challenges, emotions, and the fragile hope that, somehow, everything might eventually find its place. In the days that followed, the emotional aftershocks of Summer's revelation didn't fade, they deepened, spreading into every corner of Kyle's life like cracks in glass that refused to stop branching. What had begun as a single, shattering truth quickly became a complex reality he had to live with every waking moment. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. When it did, it was restless, filled with fragments of what-ifs and imagined memories, versions of a life where he had been there from the beginning, where he had held his daughter the day she was born, where he had known the sound of her laughter long before this moment. Instead, he woke each morning with the same quiet ache, a reminder that while he had been given something extraordinary, it had come with an irreversible loss. And yet, despite that pain, there was also something else growing inside him, something steady, something determined. It was the realization that he still had time. Not to rewrite the past, but to build something real in the present. He threw himself into that idea with a focus that surprised even himself. At first, it was the small things. He showed up early when Summer said he could visit. He paid attention, really paid attention, to every detail about his daughter. The way she tilted her head when she was curious, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about something she loved, the cautious way she interacted with him, as if she were still trying to understand where he fit into her world. And that, more than anything, humbled him. Because to her, he wasn't Dad. Not yet. He was just Kyle. That reality hit him harder than anything Summer had said. He couldn't demand a place in her life. He couldn't expect instant connection or unconditional love. Those things had to be earned, built slowly over time through consistency, patience, and trust. And so, he adjusted. He stopped trying to force emotional moments and instead focused on being present, really present, in whatever way she needed. Sometimes that meant sitting quietly while she played, offering a smile when she looked his way. Other times it meant answering her endless stream of questions, even when they caught him off guard. And occasionally, it meant stepping back entirely, allowing her space when she seemed overwhelmed by his presence. Summer noticed all of it. She watched the way Kyle tried awkwardly at times, but sincerely, to bridge the gap between them. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when his frustration slipped through, when the weight of everything he had missed surfaced in ways he couldn't fully control. But even then, he didn't walk away. He stayed. He corrected himself. He tried again. And that mattered more than anything. For Summer, this was the part she hadn't been able to predict. She had spent so long preparing for confrontation, for anger, for accusations, for resentment, that she hadn't fully allowed herself to imagine what it would look like if Kyle chose something different. If he chose to lean in instead of pulling away. It didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the years she had spent carrying this secret alone. But it created something new, something fragile, uncertain, but undeniably real. Still, not everything was as quietly hopeful as the moments between them. Outside of their small, carefully managed world, the pressure was building. Questions turned into conversations, and conversations turned into tension. People wanted answers. They wanted clarity. And more than anything, they wanted to understand why Summer had made the choice she did. Some approached her with concern, others with barely concealed judgment. There were whispers, quiet at first, then louder, about whether Kyle had been wronged, whether he had been denied something that should have been his from the beginning. Summer faced it all with a composure that masked the emotional toll it was taking on her. Because the truth was, there wasn't a single, simple answer she could give that would satisfy everyone. Her decision hadn't been made in a vacuum. It had been shaped by fear, by uncertainty, by circumstances that no longer felt as clear-cut as they once had. And now, standing in the middle of the consequences, she had to live with the reality that no matter how she explained it, someone would always see it differently. Kyle struggled with that part more than he expected. Not the whispers themselves, he had learned long ago how to ignore speculation, but the way they affected how people looked at him. There was sympathy in their eyes now. Pity even. And he hated it. Because while part of him understood why they felt that way, another part rejected it entirely. This wasn't just a story about what he had lost. It was also about what he had gained. And reducing it to a narrative of victimhood felt wrong. But that didn't mean he wasn't still searching for answers. The conversations between him and Summer grew more honest as time went on. Not easier, but deeper. They circled around the same questions again and again, peeling back layers of emotion with each discussion. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked one night, his voice quieter than it had been in the beginning, but no less intense. Summer didn't answer right away. Because this time, she knew that whatever she said couldn't just be a defense, it had to be the truth, fully and without hesitation. "I was scared," she admitted finally. "Not just of you, but of everything that came with it. What it would mean. How it would change things. I didn't know how to handle it back then. And the longer I waited, the harder it became to say anything at all." Kyle absorbed that in silence. It wasn't a justification. It wasn't an excuse. But it was real. And for the first time, he began to understand that this wasn't just something that had been taken from him, it was something she had carried, alone, for years. That didn't make it right. But it made it human. "I can't pretend it doesn't hurt," he said after a while. "I know," she replied softly. There was no resolution in that moment. No clean ending to the conversation. But there was something else, something quieter, but just as important. There was honesty. And from that honesty, something began to shift. Not all at once, and not in ways that were immediately obvious, but gradually, like the slow turning of a tide. The tension between them didn't disappear, but it changed. It became less about blame and more about understanding. Less about the past and more about what came next. And what came next was still uncertain. Because while they were learning how to navigate this new dynamic, the bigger questions still loomed. What did this mean for their future? Not just as co-parents, but as two people whose lives had always been intertwined in complicated ways. There were moments, brief, unspoken, when it felt like something familiar might still exist between them. A look that lingered a little too long. A shared laugh that came too easily. A silence that felt comfortable instead of strained. But neither of them rushed to define it. Because for now, there was something more important at stake. Their daughter. She remained at the center of everything, even as the world around her shifted. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her relationship with Kyle began to change. It showed up in small ways. The way she started seeking him out instead of waiting for him to approach. The way she began including him in her stories, her thoughts, her little observations about the world. The way she laughed more freely around him, the initial hesitation fading with each passing day. And then, one afternoon, it happened. It wasn't dramatic. There was no build-up, no moment of obvious significance. She simply looked at him, smiled, and said, "Dad." Kyle froze. Not because he didn't hear it, but because he did. Every emotion he had been holding back rushed to the surface all at once, catching him completely off guard. For a second, he couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even think clearly. And then, slowly, he smiled. It wasn't just a word. It was a beginning. Summer saw it too, the way Kyle's entire expression changed, the way something inside him seemed to settle into place. And for the first time since she had returned, she allowed herself to fully believe that maybe, just maybe, things could find a balance. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Because in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the secrets, not the shock, not even the pain. But the choice they were making now to move forward, together in some way, even if they didn't yet know exactly what that looked like. Genoa City would continue to watch, to speculate, to react. But for Kyle and Summer, the story had shifted. It was no longer about what had been hidden. It was about what they were building now, piece by piece, moment by moment. Something fragile, something complicated, but something undeniably theirs. The shift after that moment was subtle, but undeniable. It didn't erase the complications surrounding them, nor did it magically resolve the questions that still lingered between Kyle and Summer, but it changed the emotional gravity of everything. For Kyle, hearing that single word, Dad, reframed his entire perspective. The pain of what he had missed didn't disappear, but it no longer felt like the defining feature of his reality. Instead, it became part of a larger story, one that was still being written. He found himself moving differently after that. More confident, but also more careful. Every decision carried weight now, not just because of what it meant for him or Summer, but because of how it would affect his daughter. That awareness sharpened his instincts. He listened more. He reacted less impulsively. And for perhaps the first time in a long while, he started thinking beyond himself in a way that felt instinctive rather than forced. Summer noticed that too. There was a steadiness to Kyle that hadn't been there before. Not perfection, he still had moments of doubt, flashes of frustration, but a grounding sense of purpose that made him more reliable, more present. It eased something inside her that she hadn't fully acknowledged before, the fear that she might have misjudged everything by coming back. But that didn't mean the outside pressure had eased. If anything, the situation had become more visible. Their daughter's presence in Genoa City was no longer a secret whispered behind closed doors. She was part of the fabric now seen, acknowledged, and inevitably discussed. And with that visibility came new complications. There were practical questions that demanded answers. Where would she live long-term? How would they handle school, routines, stability? What role would each of them play on a daily basis? These weren't emotional hypotheticals anymore. They were real, immediate decisions that required cooperation, compromise, and a level of communication that neither Kyle nor Summer could afford to avoid. They began having those conversations slowly, sometimes awkwardly, often circling around the same concerns before landing on something workable. There were disagreements, of course there were. They came from different experiences, different instincts, different ideas of what was best. But what mattered was that they didn't shut down when those differences surfaced. They stayed in the conversation. And that, more than anything, became the foundation of what they were building. One evening, as they sat across from each other after putting their daughter to bed, the weight of everything unspoken settled into the space between them again. It wasn't tense this time, just honest. "This isn't what I expected," Kyle admitted, his voice quieter, reflective. Summer gave a small, almost knowing smile. "None of this is." He let out a soft breath, nodding. "I don't know what we are, Summer. Not anymore." Her expression softened, but she didn't rush to answer. Because she knew the truth, there wasn't a simple label that could define what they had become. "Maybe we don't have to figure that out right now," she said finally. "Maybe it's enough to just get this part right." Kyle considered that. For once, he didn't push for clarity beyond what was in front of him. Because this part, their daughter, their shared responsibility, the fragile but growing trust between them, was already more than enough to navigate. And maybe that was the point. Not every story needed to be defined all at once. Not every relationship